Why did Cregan Stark send Roddy the Ruin to fight for Rhaenyra? Warning, spoiler warning, this video contains major spoilers for House of the Dragon Season 3, including Cregan Stark, Roddy the Ruin, the Winter Wolves, and the Battle of Tumbleton. If you haven't finished the season, this is your warning. Why would Cregan Stark send a group of older northern warriors south to fight a war that had almost nothing to do with the north? And why would he choose Roddy the Ruin to lead them? The answer is actually much more complicated than simply saying that Cregan supported Rhaenyra. Cregan Stark had made a promise, and in the world of Westeros, a Stark's word carries enormous weight. When Prince Jacaerys Velaryon traveled north during the Dance of the Dragons, he met with Cregan Stark and secured the support of the North for Rhaenyra's claim. Cregan agreed to support the Blacks, but there was a problem. The North was enormous, and moving a huge army from Winterfell all the way south was going to take time. Cregan couldn't simply abandon the North and march every available soldier toward King's Landing. Winter was coming. Food mattered. Families needed protection, and the North had its own survival problems. So Cregan found a solution. He sent a smaller force ahead. That force became known as the Winter Wolves, and at their head was Lord Roderick Dustin, better known as Roddy the Ruin. Roddy wasn't a young knight looking for adventure. He was an experienced northern lord and warrior. His soldiers were also mostly older men, often described as graybeards. That detail is extremely important. The Winter Wolves weren't necessarily expected to survive. In fact, their purpose was almost the opposite. They were going south knowing that many of them would probably die. There was a practical reason for this. The North was facing a difficult winter, and every mouth that remained at home needed food. Sending older warriors south allowed younger men and families to remain behind with the resources needed to survive. So Cregan wasn't simply throwing away his soldiers. He was making a calculated decision. The older generation would go to war. The younger generation would remain in the North, and Roddy would lead the veterans. This also explains one of the most memorable lines connected to the Winter Wolves. They had not come south expecting to return home. They had come to die for the Dragon Queen. That sounds almost suicidal, but to Roddy and his men, it represented duty, honor, and sacrifice. They had a chance to make their final years meaningful while protecting their families from the coming winter. And there was another reason Cregan needed them. Rhaenyra needed immediate military support. The Black Cause was fighting on multiple fronts. The Riverlands were unstable. The Lannisters were advancing, and the Greens still controlled enormous resources. Cregan's main army could eventually march south, but Rhaenyra couldn't afford to wait. Roddy and the Winter Wolves could arrive much sooner. That made them the perfect vanguard. They could fight the battles that needed to be fought while Cregan prepared the larger northern host. And that's exactly what happened. The Winter Wolves quickly proved that Cregan had chosen the right commander. Roddy wasn't interested in cautious warfare. He was aggressive, experienced, and completely willing to take enormous risks. His men fought alongside the River Lords and became an important part of the Black War effort. At the battle by the lakeshore, the Winter Wolves repeatedly charged the Lannister forces. The fighting was brutal. The Northerners suffered enormous casualties, with roughly 2/3 of the force killed or wounded. But they helped secure a major victory for the Blacks. And this is where Roddy's nickname begins to make sense. Roddy the Ruin wasn't famous because he was invincible. He was famous because wherever he went, destruction followed. His soldiers were willing to attack enemies who appeared stronger because they didn't fear death in the same way ordinary soldiers did. That attitude became extremely useful to Rhaenyra. The Blacks needed commanders who could keep fighting even when the odds looked terrible. Roddy was exactly that kind of commander. Then came the Butcher's Ball. The Winter Wolves played an important role in the destruction of Criston Cole's army. Roddy's men helped surround the Green forces, and the defeat of Cole became one of the biggest military successes for Rhaenyra's side. By this point, Roddy was no longer simply the leader of a small northern detachment. He had become one of the Black Army's most effective battlefield commanders. But there is something important to understand about Cregan's decision. Cregan wasn't sending Roddy south because he personally wanted Roddy to die. He was sending him because Roddy was the right man for the job. Roddy understood the purpose of the Winter Wolves. He knew what Cregan wanted. He knew the North couldn't send its entire strength immediately. And he knew Rhaenyra needed soldiers now. That made Roddy the perfect bridge between Cregan's promise and Rhaenyra's immediate military needs. But eventually, the Winter Wolves reached their final battlefield, Tumbleton. The town became one of the most important locations in the dance. The Green Army, commanded by Ormond Hightower, was fighting to maintain control. The Black forces needed to break that position, and Roddy was once again placed at the center of the fighting. This time, the stakes were even higher. The Winter Wolves were already heavily depleted. They had lost many of their original soldiers. Yet, Roddy continued fighting. And in the Season 3 finale, he goes directly after Ormond. Their confrontation isn't a personal feud. It is the natural conclusion of everything that began when Cregan sent Roddy south. Roddy was there to fight for the Black cause. Ormond was commanding the Green Army. When their forces collided, Roddy became one of the men capable of reaching the enemy commander. The result was devastating. Roddy and Ormond were both caught in the destruction of Tumbleton. The show ultimately gives Roddy a brutal final stand, with Ulf's dragonfire helping turn the battlefield into chaos. So, the man Cregan sent south as a military vanguard eventually became one of the most memorable casualties of the entire war. And that's the real reason Cregan Stark sent Roddy the Ruin to fight for Rhaenyra. It wasn't simply because Cregan hated the Greens. It wasn't because Roddy was expendable. And it wasn't because Cregan wanted to send the North's oldest soldiers to their deaths. It was a combination of duty, timing, survival, and military strategy. Cregan had promised Jacaerys that the North would support Rhaenyra. But the North couldn't immediately march south with its entire army. So Cregan sent the Winter Wolves ahead. Roddy was the ideal commander because he had the experience and the temperament to lead them. And the Winter Wolves had another advantage. They weren't fighting like soldiers who expected to go home. They were fighting like men who had already accepted the possibility of death. That made them terrifying. They could take risks that younger soldiers might hesitate to take. And those risks helped Rhaenyra win several important battles. But there is also a tragic irony in Cregan's decision. Roddy and his men were sent south as a temporary force. They were supposed to help keep the Black cause alive until the larger Northern army could eventually arrive. Instead, the Winter Wolves became legends. They fought, they won, they suffered enormous losses. And eventually, almost all of them were destroyed. Cregan would later march south with another Northern army, but by then, the dance had changed dramatically. Rhaenyra was already dead, and the war was approaching its final stages. That means Roddy's mission was never really about seeing Rhaenyra sit safely on the Iron Throne. It was about keeping Cregan's promise and giving the Black cause the military support it needed at the moment it mattered. And that makes Roddy's story even more tragic. He was sent south because Cregan believed the North had a duty to honor its word. Roddy accepted that duty completely. He didn't ask whether the war would be easy. He didn't ask whether he would survive. He simply went. And when the time came, he fought exactly as Cregan expected him to fight. That is why Roddy the Ruin became such an important figure in the Dance of the Dragons. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a dragon rider, he wasn't even one of the most powerful lords in Westeros. He was a northern warrior who answered a promise with action. Cregan gave Rhaenyra soldiers, Roddy gave her victories, and eventually he gave her his life. So why did Cregan Stark send Roddy the Ruin? Because Cregan had promised the Blacks his support, but couldn't wait for the entire North to march south. Roddy and the Winter Wolves were the solution. They could move quickly, they could fight immediately, And because they were mostly older warriors, their families could remain behind with the food and resources needed to survive the coming winter. It was a practical decision, it was a political decision, and it was a deeply northern decision. The winter wolves went south knowing that many would never return. They became the sword Cregan Stark sent ahead, and Roddy the Ruin became its edge. In the end, Cregan's decision created one of the most legendary fighting forces of the dance. They came south for the Dragon Queen. They came expecting to die. And they left behind a legend that Westeros would remember long after the dragons were gone.